Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the SportsTech All-Stars podcast. We're bringing home the series focused on India. I've had such a great time speaking to so many interesting people on the topic, and our report is out already. By the time you listen to this episode, it certainly should be. So go pick that up from our website. It has been a process delving deep into what is happening in the business and tech and innovation landscape within India, globally, of course. There's so much happening, but this is a market that doesn't get enough attention from our perspective, which is why we wanted to dive deep into it and also dive deep into conversations with experts in and around that market. And one such is Unmish Parthasarathi, who is the founder and executive director at Pitcherboard Partners, a company that he runs out of Singapore, but has operated in various roles across the sports industry, including with leading names such as the ICC, IMG, and some work in Go Sports and all of that stuff. But I will not do that. Unmesh, I will let you talk about all the different things that you do. So welcome to the show.
Rohan, thank you very much. Big admirer of your work, by a distance and by a mile, physically and metaphorically as well. Thanks for having me.
No worries at all. Yeah, appreciate it. I think we first got in touch right in the early days of SportsTech X. I remember a call that we had, must have been 2019, 2020, probably 2019, I think.
Pre-pandemic. Peak of the winter in Germany.
Yeah, exactly. That's when we got introduced. And yeah, the same, been a follower of your work since then. So for those who don't know what your work is, please tell us more. What exactly is your background, and what are the different roles that, as I mentioned already, some of them that you've operated in and continue to operate in within the sports industry?
So look, I'll try and keep it simple. Those who know me know that I talk in threes. So my work has been typically at the intersection of content, code, and capital, which is content, technology, and finance. My work has been across the value chain of the industry. So starting with the agency world with IMG, then going buy side with the BBC and the SABC in South Africa, and then ESPN Star in Singapore, and then eventually going sell side at the top of the value chain with the International Cricket Council. And I've lived and worked in 3 cities for a length of time. I've been in London for a long time. I began in Delhi, and I live in Singapore. I moved to Singapore on a 3-year contract in July of 2008. So obviously the city has grown on me. But a lot of content, code, and capital across the value chain in terms of federations, agencies, and the buy side. And today, about 5 years ago, I went solo. A combination of personal and professional reasons, sandwich generation, young family, and aging parents. And the pandemic actually, despite being a setback for many, was good for us because video conferencing actually collapsed distances. So Pitcherboard Partners is a holding company which fundamentally does 3 things that I've done for 25 years. We do a lot of commercial strategy work, market entry, benchmarking, core competency, how to compete, how to differentiate. Do classic agency work, which is brokering deals across content, enterprise technology, and capital. And do a lot of work in the sort of venture development space and the early stage ecosystem space, which I'm sure will come on to speaking. So a great question, but long answer.
No, and fair, that context setting is super important. And I guess we had connected on the last topic, or the work that you do around venture investing or around startups and innovation. That's the topics that I'm most interested in, but I'm also very interested in all of it. I mean, if I saw this correctly, this is on your LinkedIn profile. I'm not digging up too much, but you started out as a reporter, wasn't it? And so, I mean, it just goes to say that your media has been the field of play for you for most of your career. Is that a fair summation?
Yeah, content, very much so. I began as a print reporter back in the days when people read the newspapers. My first contract was 1 rupee a word. This was writing copy and features and book reviews and profiles for Indian newspapers, which had gone color on the weekend, but hadn't got the reporters to fill the copy. And then from there, I went to radio and Yuvavani, and I had a weekly show called Crossroads for 450 rupees, which included my fees and 50 rupees per guest. And then I joined just by pure chance. I got introduced to Peter Hutton and ended up joining IMG Media, or TWI, as the company was then called, as their first hire in Asia. So a bit of serendipity and a bit of happenstance as well. So that's how we started. And content has actually morphed in the last decade or so, much more in a B2B context. So storytelling still remains 50% of what I do, whether it's coaching leaders, whether it's speaking at industry conventions or writing white papers or any of the other kind of work that I do on the strategy side. It's still very much context and content. It's more about getting folks to think a particular way, much more B2B in the last 10 years or so. But a 20-year apprenticeship before that hasn't hurt.
Fair. No wonder you have a way with words, especially if that was the meter with which you were paid. So yeah, how to squeeze that extra word in there is important. It's clearly a good skill that you have. And I want to set the context about your background in media, which is of course extensive. Because before we jump into, let's say, the tech and innovation space and the India related work, I just want to maybe just throw an open question. Let's say, call it a softball, call it whatever. But just your perspective on this such a dynamic sports media landscape that we're in, where media rights are, the NBA, the NFL get like that top dollar, and then nobody else gets anything else, and then you have the BCCI, which is so demanding with the IPL rights. But again, there's a cliff, and a very steep cliff when it comes to anything else within the Indian ecosystem. So maybe just your perspective on what is the media rights landscape like today? Is it a big opportunity? Is it in a crisis moment? Your thoughts?
So two things I would say. I think the industry has changed and the economics have changed in the last 10 years. If you look at a sort of 25-year window from, say, 1990 to the middle of the last decade, content supply and touch points of content consumption were finite. So you didn't have the plethora of social media, the newsfeed video, short form video, all that kind of stuff. In the last 10 years, you've had the smart device, you've had 4G penetration, which is quality and affordable data, and you've had short form video, which has a very established dopamine effect. That's led to the fragmentation of attention. In the 25 years before that, you could set your alarm clock to social occasions, whether it was the Wimbledon final or the FA Cup final or the Ashes test match or the Boxing Day test match. That's changed now. So that's one way of looking at it from that perspective, right? That the supply and the demand, both sources of content and touch points of consuming that content, have gone up exponentially in the last decade. That's one way of looking at it. That's almost the cause to where I'm going to come to next. And the consequence has fundamentally been similar to what cinema is going through in Hollywood. Historically, there wasn't much of a difference between art film, straight to TV, pay television windows, cinema, theatrical release. Today, most of the theatrical release is based on sequels. Sequels are no different from then proven IP. Same characters, same plot line, same actors. A bit like sport. Surprise, surprise. And the other extreme is art films, because the cost of production has also come down significantly in the last 10 years. So whether it is mini-series, web series, anything between 6 and 10 minutes on the internet, or whether it is short films, which is 25 minutes, or a documentary for an hour, the ability of somebody to be able to actually record, produce, edit, voice, script, graphics is far, far cheaper and quicker today than it was 10 years ago. But what that means from a sales perspective, and if you look at sports economics in the last 25 years, media rights has been the majority of your balance sheet. It fundamentally has gone down to what I call the sequelization of cinema and Hollywood, where people are putting big bets on big players, proven IPs, proven formats, because they market themselves, they cut through the noise. So 2 points I'll make. One, supply and demand has gone up. So, historically, you'd have a very acute angle. If this was like a arrow, you'd have a very acute angle of supply and demand. Now the demand has grown and the supply has grown. It's a very different way of looking at it with this fragmentation of attention. And the converse idea is only he who shouts loudest and the most creatively actually wins. So it's no surprise that you actually have properties which are either voluminous and leagues come into play. I think the NBA is a very good example. Or there are events which suck out any alternative supply. What do I mean by that? When an ICC event is going on, Champions Trophy, there's no other cricket being played in the cricketing world. So as a cricket fan, you're getting a premium event with the best teams and you have zero opportunity cost and you have to stay up to watch it. I think the NFL is similar, 16 weekends, Super Bowl, big part of the public culture, and off you go. So what is succeeding is long 6-8 month perennial supply of league matches or events, which is like a Champions Trophy, can be like the IPL. I think the IPL of all the T20 franchises comes the closest to an ICC event because guess what? All the best players in the world are playing that. So, but it's a commercial default as opposed to a constitutional default. So media rights is very much become a very sequel-oriented play. It does mean that the non-mainstream, non-bestseller, supposedly niche sports can't follow the broadcasting model, but they definitely can follow the narrow casting model in terms of digital, although the economics there aren't that easy.
Yeah, and it's a challenge whether they go direct to consumer, whether they find another streaming partner, how do they actually get to market? This is the thing that we're seeing. At the same time, you're seeing this widening of interest into picking up these sports rights, right? Of course, whether a Netflix and Amazon, etc., were not looking at sports IP not that long ago, and Netflix will go and commit to talk about alternative sports. They'll go and buy the next two Women's World Cups, right? And they'll bring that onto Netflix, which I'm sure will push that demand in a big way. A sneaky lead into our next topic that we're going to cover, which is a deep dive into the business of women's sports, but we'll save that for next month. At the same time, so we're seeing this highly dynamic landscape, and you, as somebody who's lived in so many different markets in three different areas, three different parts of the world, how does that compare? How do the geographies themselves stack up against each other, in your perspective?
Look, great question. If you look, let's just say we're looking at the commercial basis of every market, be it Europe, be it Asia Pacific, be it Sub-Saharan Africa. A lot of the value on the business model of advertising has been a function of eyeballs. Brands don't buy content. Brands buy audiences which consume the content. Again, in the last 10 years, the brands have gone much more towards certain social media and short-form video. So there's been one disruption of you're seeing less and less top-class content on free-to-air television. Secondly, pay television has never exclusively been pay only. They also show ads. And increasingly, they're being bundled by the distributor of the channel who's selling you home broadband, which is an 85% margin business. And they sell that into you along with the content. So that's a second way of looking at the economics. And the third way of looking at the economics is, as you said, is more around what the streamers are doing, the native streamers are doing, and the native long-form streamers are doing. So I'm not talking YouTube Shorts or Reels or TikTok, but I'm looking at Amazon Prime, DAZN, and Netflix. I think their economics is very, very different. The reason why a lot of the players who traditionally did not partake in sport, like Netflix, are coming to it is primarily because of two things. A, the cost of content for entertainment content, scripted, has gone up. And secondly, the appointment to view nature of sport means that you can drive large campaigns, penetrate segments who are not watching your catalog. And unlike any other genre, sports fans are a very loyal fan. They have an extremely high elasticity. Fandom is based on following a club or a player or a team come hell or high water. That doesn't necessarily happen in music or drama or cinema. So if you put those two lenses where segments can be defined by the genre, and there's appointment to view from a marketing perspective, and the genre actually attracts a segment which is very loyal, so long as you sort of meet base case expectations, they'll stay with you. So hopefully I've sort of taken you through the sort of advertising piece and then more towards the sort of pay television subscription piece, and increasingly what I sort of call content commerce piece, which is a very different piece altogether.
Yeah, and that journey is the one that I think we're in the last, obviously, phase now, where sports is also going past the fanatic fan, right? With the person who's just obsessed with their sport, into the casual fan as well. Hey, I also watch a bit. I don't follow it all season. I don't paint my face and wear that jersey every game, every time it's on screen, but I'm interested, and sports is drawing into that. And the rest of the storytelling really fits into that arc, I'd imagine, as well. So sticking on with that theme of the different types of content that you establish, I want to call back to the previous question again, just the geographies, because I want to lead that into the Indian market. So because you've worked in the Middle East, obviously in the UK and India and the different parts, is there a big difference between the sports audience in India versus anywhere else that you've seen in the world?
I think there's nowhere in India where the audience is so young, so connected, and multilingual. I think those three things, if you have language, device connectivity, broadband connectivity, and demographics, I think it's very hard to find a market which is so diverse from a linguistic perspective and so parochial or narrow from a content perspective where cricket dominates. Even if you look at a market like China, which is broadly singular market, but multiple tonality in terms of the dialects of Chinese, there's a winter sport piece, there's a summer sport piece, there's a team sport, there's an Olympic sport, individual sports. So the tradition of sport is far more varied across many more codes, and the language remains simple. Whereas India is the other way around. It's a very cricket, single sport dominated culture across multiple languages. So that's one lens to keep in mind. The other thing to keep in mind is storytelling is a very important part of Indian culture, and necessarily oral storytelling, which I think people tend to sort of discount. Once upon a time, ek baat ki baat hai. And you say that's a very typical piece of it's a muscle that a child learns at a very, very young age. And every sports encounter always starts with once upon a time, and there's always the hope of winning. And the third piece is, I think, in the last 10 to 15 years, I think ever since Abhinav Bindra kind of won the Olympic gold in Beijing, and Dhoni's team won in 2007 against a format which wasn't quite there. Gopi did so amazingly well in badminton. There's alternative players who come out who are not from traditional cities. And that leads to following of segments and idolization of certain sports, which wasn't there 10 years ago. So these are very unique sort of tailwinds that I'm giving in mind in terms of India. Young demographic, yes, common with other parts of the world, but not so much, not 1 billion people, 600 million people. A singular sport, yes, but we've got white ball, red ball, and we now have men's and women's and the under 19s. We have multiplicity of languages, but a common sensibility as a country, which is a very important piece. Unlike, say, a country like Spain, where they have 3 different dialects, 3 different cultures, and it's a very different piece. Only Iberia brings them together. So that's how I would distinguish India being quite different. Talking about my travels, 15 years ago, I had the privilege of working at the SABC, a bit more than that, for the 2010 FIFA World Cup. And they were doing nightly news in 6 languages, out of which 1 was an oral language, Venda, doesn't even have a script. And our task was fundamentally to look at news and sports news at the morning show. And a lot of comparables, because that was a country where the Afrikaans men more often than not played rugby, the Anglo-Saxon white male played cricket, and the coloreds and the Bantu black man played football. So very clear segmentation of 3 very good sports, and they were extremely good. Large broadcast, free-to-air and pay TV, and a very, very good home league structure. So that was very fascinating in terms of how that was, because I think the franchise and the league system was far more advanced across 3 different sports because they had 3 very clear segments. So again, drawing a parallel in terms of how media rights in those markets have changed, yet the size of the country was not that large. Pretty much the size of Maharashtra, to put things into context. It's very, very different.
And this is the thing, that level of depth of understanding of what exactly you're selling, or what is the property that you're selling into, or the property that you're selling and the market that you're selling into. How do you make that distinction? You explain it so eloquently and so clearly, but perhaps it wasn't that clear at the time when you're in the moment, or certainly in the process when you're bidding for rights. And I think coming back to the Indian context, this is the thing, because in India, we're all looking for what is the next thing outside of cricket. Are these sports emerging? The ISL has been around for a while, but maybe that league hasn't kicked off as many would have liked or expected. There are topics whether it's pickleball, or maybe pickleball is ahead of paddle, at least it seems in this moment, but other leagues which are trying to establish a presence. And I come back to, we talk about this in our content in terms of the opportunities there are in Indian sport. And I say that outside of the tier 1, let's say the tier 1 leagues outside of cricket, I think those are struggling, but there are huge opportunities outside of elite sports from a broadcasting perspective. Do you feel the same about that? And if yes to that, are there any other opportunities around the Indian sports ecosystem that you really keep your eye on?
Yeah. So let's stick with the content piece, and that's a good one. Let me give you two different perspectives, right? In the land of the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, the Jataka tales haven't got much cut through, right? The volume, the history, the characters of those 2 treatises is very, very different than the sort of storybook nature of a Jataka tales. Had its place, and it can be anything else. It can be R.K. Narayan, whatever the case, Malgudi days. I mean, that's the way I always look at Indian sport. If you look at cricket, people tend to forget that cricket was something we became world champions in 1983. Then an entire generation came along, television came along, leisure came along, per capita incomes grew, infrastructure grew, the board invested wisely in the money that he made, stadiums, grassroots, high performance, all that kind of stuff. Suddenly you've got a talent base, and then suddenly the IPL comes along. And then suddenly the pay television wars go up another level altogether, and then Geo comes along. So if you look at these 4 or 5 pillars, these are happenstance. From 83 to 2007 to the IPL being formed, and 2007 I mean India beating Pakistan in South Africa, to the IPL being born with a cup of tea, as the legend goes, to the pay television world, high definition came in, to mobile coming in, to Geo coming in, to actually you leading the talent coming in the meantime. These are 4 or 5 significant tailwinds, which each are sort of coming in just as the previous one is reaching diminishing return. It's no different than the plots and the multiple plots within a Ramayana and Mahabharata. Hence my point. It's a multi-plot, multi-character situation. It's a very, very important thing to keep in mind. And from that perspective, the second point I was going to make was the IPL was the best thing and potentially not the best thing to ever happen to Indian sport. Because the thinking is, we've only seen the tip of the iceberg. let's have a franchise system, and whether it's badminton or tennis or kabaddi or table tennis, whatever the case might be, it's happened on IPL, we'll do it again. And I think that was also a figment of the thinking of that generation of entrepreneurs and investors in the last decade. I think what you're seeing now with pickleball, potentially paddle, I think Coco is kind of similar. Kalari Payetu, boat races, martial arts, mixed martial arts. There's a new genre of events which are coming in, which are not mass market, which are very mid-market or niche market, but they know who their segment are. So my second point really is that just because when I've seen once seen the consequence of cricket in the IPL without losing track perhaps of the cause and how long success takes. It's easier to sort of say, oh, but it's India's dominated. Of course it is dominated, because there's been every decade, there's been a reason for the game to step up commercially, community-wise, coaching-wise, which will happen in the coming decade and on some of the other sports that India is doing. And there my thesis very much is anything which is within an enclosed space and a team sport, I think has a very high chance in India. I think Coco has a higher chance than football. I think pickleball has a higher chance than, say, tennis. Coco and pickleball both are pretty gender comparable, gender neutral as sports as well. And it's very much beginning as a participation sport, then becoming a spectator sport. Whereas hockey, football, tennis, boxing have always been a spectator sport first. You watch them at the Asian Games or the Commonwealth Games or on television. So two different points to be made. One, let's not forget that cricket is a 40-year-old phenomenon which has had 3, 4, 5 very lucky, fortunate, successive tailwinds. And secondly, just because you see the tip of the iceberg doesn't necessarily mean that the next hour is not going to be as deep. There's an enclosed spaces thesis more and more I'm sensing is going to actually work in India's favor.
How does tech and innovation play a role in delivering this next wave of opportunities to the Indian economy?
Blimey, how do you save third
What are
world
the
debt?
standout?
No, fair
what are the
point.
standard
Look,
topics that you look at?
let's break it down. Let's break it down the impact of sports tech into 3 areas, right? What I call on pitch, which is high performance recovery, as the case might be. Along the pitch, which is more around the business side of running academies, running stadiums, enterprise resource planning, ticketing, F&B, that kind of stuff. And away from the pitch, which effectively is your fan engagement, communities, grassroots, the case might be. Okay, if you sort of break that down into sort of concentric circles, the on pitch, the along pitch, and outside the pitch, that's one way of framing it. I think if you look at the outside of pitch fan engagement piece, again, I think we've been guilty of the IPL phenomenon. We have seen what European football clubs do or the American leagues do, and they do it on Meta, and they do it on Reels, and they do it on Search and the Google One Box, and we try to copy that. I always go back and say, look at what the real money gaming people have done. It's a genuinely Indian sport with a genuinely Indian passion, and they have made a lot of money in a fairly good, high governance way. So that to me is real fan engagement, because you're not only asking them to partake with their time, but their wallets. So again, if you start putting it from that perspective, that to me is that is a learning there where it's a missed opportunity in this cycle, and we'll come back. India's ability to sort of come back and relearn is very, very good. That's sort of off the pitch piece, right? Along the pitch, I think is gray in India, because the ownership of stadiums, real estate, the talent is still between the government. See, sport is a state government subject, yet you have the National Olympic Association and the National Sports Federation. We have the pathway to the Olympics. So that's not an impediment. That's just the reality of how the off the pitch pieces. So outside the pitch, we're very clear. I think fan engagement 2.0 is going to be a lot more like where real money gaming was. There are many more Indian models. If you look at the e-commerce model or the fast commerce model in India in the last 5 years, it's very different from Flipkart, which is fundamentally looking at what Amazon was doing. So that innovation will come. Along pitch, I think will take a bit of time. On pitch is amazing, because science, physios, nutritionists, psychologists, we're a very geeky nation. We're a very quantitative nation, and increasingly very, very patriotic nation, but patriotism with objectivity, to sort of say, how do I actually get that incremental 1%? Because that's eventually what decides whether I go on the podium or not. So I don't think there's a shortage of people. I don't think there's a shortage of equipment. It's more that you're probably underserved given the supply of equipment and manpower. But that will change, because those are things that you can build organically, and you can actually make it into a career.
Yeah, I really like that trifecta kind of approach. We have a similar one. If you're familiar with our content, we talk about sports technology or sports tech for the athlete, for the fan, and for the executive. Basically the same three profiles. And within India, we've seen, certainly with our data, and the report will also speak to it, is that a lot of money is spent on the fan, not enough money or investment goes towards the executive, the B2B side of things. Beyond one really mature league, no other leagues have their own purchasing power of buying and investing in solutions. So we see that as a big opportunity to look forward to. But for the athlete, is actually the biggest one. Beyond the pro athlete, it's getting more people active, getting more people playing, because we don't talk only about the pro athlete. It's, we borrow Bill Bowerman's definition. If you have a body, you are an athlete. So just India being more active, especially around the youth categories, I think it's a big one, driving towards the next Olympics, which is the last one I want to ask you about and bring you in on. But are you bullish on this overall increase in activity and leading up to a potential Olympics?
Well, let me just go back a bit, and because I think I want to cite 2 or 3 companies which, to my mind, are sort of front runners of what this wave is. You mentioned, participation, right? So there are companies like Sports Village, which are doing stuff at scale. Sports for All doing stuff at scale. SportWhat doing stuff at scale. Each of them are using technology in their own way, right? From an athlete-centric perspective. I think from an executive perspective, a lot of the value is actually coming more on the media side of things, simply because that's something the executives control as assets, as opposed to stadiums or ticketing, which is the traditional American European model, because you own the stadium. If you're a tenant, you don't really care about the property as much as if you're a landlord. But if you look at guys like Quidditch and what they're doing, if you look at what Stupa is doing, those are the kind of technologies of this generation, of this decade. They've been able to make something which is in India, for India, and potentially for the world. So just calling out certain companies, and had the privilege of working very closely with both Rahat and Gaurav at Quidditch, and know what Megha is doing at Stupa, and say that at SportWhat. I think they, to my mind, are bellwethers of where we can go, because their limitation and ambitions aren't limited by what's possible within the Indian ecosystem. They may also be looking at it not just necessarily East and West, but India and the global South. So even the lens at which they're seeing first, second, third market is very, very different.
No, super fair. And it's a fun coincidence that pretty much every company that you've named is featured in the report in some way, either as a company to look out for or even as a report partner in some cases.
I'm glad we can both be wrong, which is good.
Well, we hope so. We hope so anyway. But yeah, just a word on the growing momentum it feels, at least to me, and I'm very much Indian, but geographically a little bit further away than you are in Singapore. But looking from the outside in, it certainly feels like there is a growing momentum around the business of sport in India. Do you share that sentiment?
Look, I think there's 2 ways of looking at this, right? What is the internal view with 2036 as a North Star, and what's the external view? I think the external view is very much driven by what I call the TINA factor. There is no alternative. If today you are a manufacturer, company, club, franchise, league, media company, tech company, supplements, whatever the case might be, there's nowhere in the world in the coming decade that you'll be able to get your hands on 500 million people who will have a per capita spending capacity of $100 a month. Don't forget, that's how Sky began 30 years ago. $100 a month. That was their ARPU. Significant business, good margins, repeatable. So, from the outside in, you can't ignore it. If you look at the BRICS argument, whether it's Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, there are different challenges in different parts of the world. Not to say India hasn't got challenges, but, ceteris paribus, all things being equal, you're okay. Language, governance, all that kind of stuff. The inside view is more interesting because the stakeholders are trying to actually, at one level, make the most of what they believe is their opportunity in this wave, right? In a very proactive manner. And then there are guys who are sort of just there for the ride, love of the sport. It's not really a priority for them, but they're right place, right time, and very good at adapting. And I think if I look at my association with the Go Sports Foundation, it's a 17-year-old organization. My association is 8-9 years old since 2016 at the Rio Olympics. We are driven by change the script as the hashtag. We're driven by the pursuit of excellence and the inclusiveness importance also of social inclusion from sport. But if you start looking at that from that perspective, that lens is a very different kind of perspective to how an Olympic can change the sports sensibility of a nation. I think China has done that in a very manufactured way. Australia did that beautifully with Sydney. There are enough examples in other parts of the world where it hasn't gone to plan. I was in London when the award actually happened, and worked with the BBC on the Stratford project of continuity and legacy and all that kind of stuff. So I think in India, the multiple choices, there are probably 3 to 5 choices. One is in terms of infrastructure facility, and it needs to be green, which I think we may miss the boat on. not because of lack of intent, but just because of lack of vision and ability. There's very few comparables in the global south of green stadiums infrastructure. That's one. Two, I think the wave of athletes that we have got today, even at the Go Sports Foundation, we have north of 150 athletes across 28 different disciplines. 34 went to Paris. 30 went to Paris across both para and the games, across 9 disciplines. Now, if you sort of, an Olympic or a World Cup is won a decade in advance because you have this, as I said, you have tailwinds which are successive and everything becomes better and better and better and better. The team which won the Thomas Cup, which we had a fair representation in, didn't necessarily do as well as was expected in Paris. But there's a whole bunch coming under them. People forget that Gopi began the whole thing and Prakash began it many years ago. So I think there's a whole idolatory and structured coaching of athletes and legends in sport, which is driving a lot of it. Abhinav's done amazing work. Rahul's doing great work in cricket. Gopi's under. So I think there's that second piece, which is very, very important. It's going to be times 10, where suddenly there's going to be many more academies. So I think learning and coaching is going to be a huge growth area. Thirdly, I think there's going to be a lot of high performance technology, which will bring together 3 things in India, which is very Indian. One is Jugaad, which is the way of how do you Indianize and hack your way into a very important piece, right? The other is Riyaz. Riyaz is this whole thing about actually of penance and being driven by the purpose. It's a very important part of that patience and that perseverance is very important in this entire generation, as the case might be. The larger piece is impact. People still feel that the larger impact of sport in India is not on the podium. So I think there's an infrastructure piece, there's a human capital piece, and there's a technology piece. Those, to my mind, are the 3 largest opportunities of the next decade. How it pans out, there are multiple externalities and there are multiple dependencies. But who would have thought 10 years ago that we'd have so many unicorns and so many startups and, there's a very different piece altogether. But the timing of 2036 in terms of where the Indian society, economy, polity is at, I think that's very good.
And the timing really feels like now, in terms of you building our businesses in sports, like you're in the early wave. You're not late to the party at all, far from it. You're very much early to the party. So people who can build and stand and stay on that build for years and decades to come. Yeah.
I'll have a contrary, not view, but dimension to what you've just said and to what I have said. I think the beauty of the Olympics is that it gives you a North Star. The limitation is that it's one city. For a country like India, IPL got 10 franchises and it can have another 5 tomorrow. So a country like India, London having the Olympics is very different. Sydney potentially so as well. Paris definitely. For a country like India, and Victoria tried that with the Commonwealth Games. It's hard to do that. Even Beijing, it was all Beijing and then sailing was in Qingdao. So I think that is a potential limitation. But then again, the AIS in Canberra, at the Australian Institute of Sport, it was responsible for 30 years of growth. So there are different ways of looking at that also, but it's an important caveat to keep in mind.
Yeah, I think it's a fair point. But at the same time, the Olympics themselves are looking at how they can be more sustainable, go to multi-city models, and probably by then, which is a good decade plus away, things might emerge, but it might not just be one Ahmedabad base, which is probably what it's likely to be, or whichever other city you want to call it, might be spread out a bit more. But I think the lead up to it, to your point, all the other stuff that it'll bring, the desire to do well at the Olympics, apart from just hosting it, because India will want to put on a good show, will fuel so much into the athlete economy and then the fan economy as well. Unmish, we have actually absolutely motored through this episode, so I do have to bring it home. We obviously could have gone on for a bit. So I'll throw on to you first. What's coming up? What are the next 12, 18 months? We've talked about what's coming up in the Indian economy and shared our future perspective on that. But to give you a chance to talk about what's coming up at Pitcherboard and just everything else that you do as well.
Okay, let's talk about threes as well, right? I think coming out of the pandemic, the last 3 festivals have promised a lot in the first quarter, and more often than not, they've started to receive. I think this year might be a bit different, mainly because all of the sources of ambiguity or instability are now known. Everything's out there. Interest rate, inflation, polity, geopolitics, everything's out there. So it's for you to sort of price it in. So I think that makes me quite bullish. 2, I think the world is turning towards Asia in a very explicit manner, in multiple ways. Economy, commerce, culture, creativity, human capital, as the case might be. And with English being the lingua franca, predominantly in the West, and India being the largest English-speaking country, east of the Suez, I think it's a very interesting time for the country. Which of our partners we motor along, or we diversify more and more and more. It's more about fractionalizing what I do. fundamentally three things: a lot of work on commercial strategy, international expansion, partnerships, that kind of stuff. Classic sales agency model, representing content, technology, or finance and brokering that. And doing a lot more stuff on the thought leadership side, white papers, events, potentially a podcast, which we've spoken about. And thanks for your advice on that. And maybe even a newsletter. I just need to find time to do all this. So I'm trying to be a T20 batsman who's actually brought up as a test player or a non-limited overs player. I would say I'm a test player by country mile.
At least there are good examples of that transition being made successfully. So I'm very optimistic that you will as well. Now, lots to look forward to, obviously, and we'll stay tuned. The best way to get in touch with you, I assume, is via email or LinkedIn. We'll share your LinkedIn in the show notes. Is that fair? Yeah.
No, LinkedIn is the best. And before we clock up, Ron, thank you for what you do. I think you've been a pioneer in what you do. It's not easy being a pioneer. Famously, when Columbus left Genoa, everybody expected him to fall off the earth. So what you're doing is pioneering stuff, so more force to you. All of us are there to try and help you as much as you can. It takes a village, but eventually it takes one person to take the lead. So what you're doing is pioneering. So keep going, and we appreciate what you do.
Thank you for the kind words. I don't know if the parable to Columbus is a long way away, but yeah, it is fun. It is fun. We enjoy certainly what we do. My last one before I let you go, Unmish, I have to speak about our sports fandom, because I believe we all are who work in the industry are fortunate enough too. What has been your favorite sporting moment?
Oh, difficult. Okay, can I have two? One as a fan, one as a practitioner.
Absolutely. One
fan has to be Wankhede 2011 World Cup final.
Iconic.
It was great. I was part of the sort of media team from the ESPN. I was there at Wankhede with my brother as well, actually, which was very special. And
sorry, for those who don't know, we're talking about the 2011 India World Cup victory, which
correct,
is
against Sri Lanka, which at halftime seemed very, very unlikely.
I've actually had Gary Kirsten on the spot, so we've managed to talk to him about that as well. So I've really enjoyed talking about that.
Very different piece. So that's as a fan, and as a practitioner, Rhyming, that's a long time ago. 98 Alfred Dunhill Cup. I had the good fortune of interviewing Michael Jordan. We door-stopped him, and I was working for the Associated Press, which was the joint venture with IMG, and we draw it as hollow. My mother has met the Dalai Lama, and she said when she met him, she felt that she was in the presence. When Jordan looks at you from whatever it was, 6'10" or whatever, I barely got my questions out, and he would have answered whatever he wanted to anyway. So my job was to keep the mic in the right place. So that probably is the high point. So if the high point of my content career is 30 years ago, it's all been downhill since.
Or maybe you have the next Jordan to look forward to that you're going to have on your podcast or something like that. No, that's a good one. Thank you so much, Unmish, for joining us. You stay tuned to all the great work that you do. Thank you for all the great work that you do. And thank you for chatting about the Indian sports market. And we're all optimistic about it, clearly.
One step at a time.
Brilliant. That's a wrap, guys, for another episode on SportsTech All-Stars podcast. I think our last, maybe there's one more in this India series. Look at that report. It should be out already. And we'll see you guys next week. Cheers.
Thanks for listening to the SportsTech All-Stars podcast with Rohan Malhotra. If you like our show, let us know and leave a review. And if you want to know more about us, check out sportstechx.com, where you can find our latest industry reports and updates. For a deeper dive into all things sports tech, check out our comprehensive database, SportsTechDB, at sportstechdb.com. Don't forget to follow us on social media. You can find us at SportsTechX on Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. Join us next time for another insightful conversation with a leader in sports tech.